The wind came without warning, slicing through the thick pines of Glacier National Park as though it carried a message meant only for me. My name is Elias. I'm 28, and I've spent years chasing the quiet places of the world, the remote forests, the forgotten trails, the edges of maps where humans rarely wander. I tell people I camp to escape, to find solitude, but deep down I know I'm searching for something else, something unnameable, something that calls when the trees sway just so, when the mountains hum in a low, vibrating rhythm that reaches straight into the chest. That May, in 2023, I pitched my small tent at the edge of Lake McDonald, where the morning fog hung low over the water like a secret waiting to be told. The forest around me seemed alive in a way that made my skin crawl. Not because it was dangerous, not because bears or mountain lions lurked, but because it felt conscious, observing, and deeply patient. The first night was quiet, deceptively so. I set up my camp and lit a small fire, the kind that barely held back the darkness, the kind that leaves most of the world swallowed by blackness just beyond its ring of light. I remember the smell of damp pine needles mixing with the smoke, the sound of water lapping gently against the rocks at the lake's edge. I should have felt at peace, but something was off. Somewhere above, a branch snapped, then another, each sound loud enough to make me flinch, yet not loud enough to reveal the shape or size of what was moving. It was the kind of noise that can convince your mind of anything, that a tree is falling, that an animal is moving, or that something is waiting. I told myself it was the wind. Glacier is notorious for sudden gusts, unpredictable and violent, and the locals always warned hikers about the unstoppable wind that can tear across the valley without mercy. But when the third branch fell, smashing mere feet from my tent, I could not ignore the chill crawling up my spine. By the second night, the wind became a character in my story, unpredictable and almost sentient. I had hiked into the park seeking silence, yet every gust seemed purposeful, almost deliberate. I would sit in my sleeping bag, listening to the trees moan and creak, imagining shapes just beyond the firelight, imagining eyes glinting between the trunks. A few campers passed my sight during the day, local guides with quick smiles and shorter words, and when I asked about the wind, they only shrugged. "It's Glacier," one man said, his voice low. "It moves the way it wants. You never know where it'll strike." I laughed, but not really. There's a difference between knowing something in theory and living it at 3 a.m. when the wind snaps another branch, closer than before, so close it rattles my tent poles and sends my heart hammering in my throat. The most unnerving part was how methodical it all felt. Each night, the branches fell in patterns that almost seemed like warnings, small branches first, then larger ones, until I could hear the forest breathing around me. One evening, I ventured out of the tent, flashlights slicing through the darkness, and saw the aftermath. A massive branch had cracked and fallen across the trail I'd intended to hike the next morning. The bark was splintered in a way that suggested it had been under pressure for days, maybe weeks, waiting for the exact moment the wind would strike. Standing there, I realized that nature wasn't random. It was patient. It wasn't simply dangerous. It was watching, testing, and waiting for me to misstep. I felt my confidence shrink, my bravado vanish. Suddenly, my solo adventure felt less like freedom and more like intrusion, like a trespasser in a space that demanded respect I had yet to earn. I slept fitfully, the wind rattling and tearing at the trees above me, and I awoke to the sound of smaller twigs snapping underfoot. I unzipped the tent cautiously, peering into a gray morning, and noticed something I hadn't before. The ground around my campsite was marked with small gouges and impressions, subtle enough to miss in daylight, but significant enough to suggest that something or someone had passed during the night. My mind raced. Could it have been animals? Possibly. Something about the spacing, the direction, the almost ritualistic spacing of the debris felt intentional. I packed up slowly, taking a circuitous route around the site, watching shadows move through the mist like they had their own agenda. Every rustle, every snap was magnified. By mid-morning, I realized that fear wasn't my enemy. It was my lens, my way of seeing and respecting the forest's true nature. That night, I made a different choice. Instead of staying near the lake where the wind was strongest, I moved further into a hollow lined with fir trees, a natural buffer that reduced the gusts but did not remove the tension. I made a small fire and prepared my meal, listening as the wind shifted and roared in the distance. That's when it happened. The branch came down directly behind me. I had time to jump, barely, my heart in my throat, and when I turned, I saw the trunk snap like a whip and hit the ground with a sound that resonated through the hollow. I was shaken, but I realized something profound. The wind had taught me something. It had forced me to pay attention, to respect the space I occupied, and to understand that survival here required humility, observation, and patience. Fear had become a teacher, and I had finally stopped ignoring the lessons. The following days passed in a tense rhythm. The wind would howl at unpredictable intervals, branches would fall with shocking precision, and shadows would seem to move where there was nothing. I learned to anticipate, to read the signs, the subtle tremor in a tree before it finally let go, the way the mist swirled just before a gust, the sudden silence that preceded a snap. Each night I recorded my experiences, speaking aloud into a small recorder, trying to capture the truth of what was happening. Not for fame, not for followers, but to remember what it felt like to be so utterly small in a vast, living world that demanded recognition. The park became more than a location. It became a presence, a living entity that challenged me on every level, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. By the final night, I felt a strange intimacy with the wind, a mutual understanding that we had been circling each other for days. I lit my fire and watched as the darkness pressed in from all sides, the sound of branches breaking in the distance like a private symphony composed for my awareness alone. And then, in the deep silence between gusts, I felt it, the undeniable sensation that I had changed. The forest had not been cruel, nor the wind capricious. It had been a test, an intricate dance of perception and patience, and I had survived not because I was strong, but because I had learned to move with respect, awareness, and attentiveness. The fear that had once paralyzed me had transformed into something else, a connection, a clarity, a trembling understanding that the wilderness is not conquered. It is witnessed, honored, and felt in the marrow of your bones. I left Glacier National Park the next morning, my tent packed and my belongings loaded, but I carried more than supplies. I carried the sound of the wind, the taste of fear turned into wisdom, and the knowledge that some lessons cannot be taught except by the world itself, in its most raw and unrelenting form. As the mountains faded behind me, the memory of crashing branches lingered, echoing in my mind, whispering that no adventure worth taking comes without risk, and no story worth telling is free from shadow. I drove away in silence, the roar of the wind still singing in my ears, and understood for the first time that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's standing awake in it, breathing with it, and carrying its lesson forward, long after the gusts have passed. I still remember the night like it was etched in the fibers of my memory. A night where the silence of the desert whispered secrets that no soul should ever hear. My name is Caleb Mercer. I was 28 at the time, and I had been wandering the backroads of Joshua Tree National Park for years, chasing the kind of solitude that only the desert can offer. The landscape is deceptive in its beauty. Jagged boulders that pierce the sky, cacti that stand like sentinels, and an expanse so vast that even the moon seems small when it casts its silver over the sand. I had always sought the wild as a refuge, a place to feel alive. Yet that September night, I realized that isolation comes with a price, and sometimes that price is far heavier than you can anticipate. I arrived at my usual campsite just as dusk was bleeding into night. The wind had a dry, brittle quality that rattled the branches of the Joshua trees, creating a rhythm almost like distant footsteps. I had planned this trip meticulously, bringing my tent, sleeping bag, and the small comforts that make the wilderness tolerable. But what I hadn't counted on was the inexplicable series of events that seemed to unfold as if the desert itself had decided to test me. The sun sank beneath the horizon, and I began the ritual that marked every evening, gathering firewood and preparing a campfire. There's a meditative rhythm to building a fire, the scraping of the sticks, the smell of dry pine, the anticipation of warmth. Yet despite every effort, the flames refused to ignite. I struck matches, used lighter fluid, even coaxed with the careful layering of kindling, and still nothing. The night grew colder, the wind sharper, and the shadows of the rocks and trees deepened, folding around me like a living thing. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. The desert has a way of twisting time. Every attempt at fire became a confrontation, a silent duel with forces I couldn't understand. And then the first sound reached me. A low hum, electric and almost imperceptible, vibrating through the rocks beneath my feet. My heart skipped. The campfire, which should have been my ally, had become a mirror of the night's hostility, reflecting my vulnerability. I flicked on my flashlight and scanned the area, expecting some wandering camper or the buzz of nearby power lines, but the park was remote, completely isolated. Nothing. And yet the hum persisted, subtle at first, then unmistakable, resonating from the very air around me, as though the desert itself was alive with some unseen current. I'm not proud of what I did next, but fear has a way of distorting reason. I climbed a nearby boulder to get a better view, my flashlight cutting through the darkness in jerky movements, shadows leaping across the twisted trunks of the Joshua trees. From that height, I could see the horizon, flat and empty, yet the hum was louder here, vibrating through the soles of my boots. Something was wrong. Not with the park, not with nature itself, but with the energy of the place, the way it seemed to resist the very act of illumination, as if it resented my intrusion. My hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but from the awareness that the night had teeth. Every instinct I had honed in years of camping screamed that I was being watched, yet every rational thought argued against it. I descended and returned to my tent, desperate to find refuge in the artificial comfort of fabric and sleeping bags. The hum followed me, threaded between the folds of my gear, persistent and unnerving. I checked my phone for a signal, for any source of reassurance, but there was nothing. The screen glowed, the battery full, yet even the light refused to illuminate anything beyond the edges of my tent. It felt as though the desert had absorbed every spark of human ingenuity, leaving me in a vacuum where darkness reigned absolute. I tried to calm myself, reciting mantras about preparation and rationality, but even my voice sounded strange, hollow, swallowed by the desert. And then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible voice, like someone whispering just beyond the rim of my hearing, carried by the wind yet impossibly close. My heart locked in my chest. I strained to listen, but the words were gone before I could understand them. I spent the night pacing between the tent and the stubborn firewood, each strike of a match a small act of defiance. Shadows shifted in impossible ways, stretching across the sand, gathering in corners where the light didn't reach. My mind raced, imagining figures slipping between the rocks, eyes glinting in the darkness. But when I turned, the desert offered only the cold indifference of its stones. By the early hours, exhaustion dulled my fear, but a deep unease settled in its place, a knowledge that some forces do not forgive trespass. I sat on the edge of my sleeping bag, shivering under the weak illumination of a dying flashlight, and realized that the true danger wasn't just the dark, but the way it could make you doubt yourself, make the familiar strange, turn a simple camping trip into a confrontation with your own fragile courage. When the first light of dawn finally bled into the sky, I approached the fire one last time, almost in surrender. I struck the match. A small flare caught, and the flames hungrily consumed the kindling. Relief flooded me. but it was tinged with the memory of the night. The desert was quiet now, as if it had merely been holding its breath, waiting for me to see how far my resolve would stretch. I packed my campsite, leaving no trace behind, but the hum lingered in my memory, a reminder that some places harbor secrets that cannot be tamed or explained. Driving away, I felt the weight of solitude more heavily than ever, aware that the wilderness is not just a place for adventure. It is a mirror, reflecting every fear, every hesitation, every shadow we carry within ourselves. I learned that night that fear is not always about monsters or legends. Sometimes it's about understanding that nature has rules we do not control, energies we cannot rationalize. It is about the quiet terror that seeps in when every spark of human ingenuity is rendered useless, when light refuses to bend to your will, and the world itself seems to withhold its mercy. That night at Joshua Tree became more than a story. It became a lesson, an intimate encounter with the uncanny, a reminder that the wilderness in its vast, silent expanse is alive with its own consciousness. And when you sit by a campfire that refuses to light, you are forced to confront not only the shadows around you, but the ones that exist within, unrelenting and patient, waiting for the night to test you. The sun had barely climbed when I finally tore myself from the remnants of my stubborn fire, the ash still clinging to the stones like a warning. My hands were raw, my nerves frayed, and yet a strange clarity had settled over me, an awareness sharpened by the night's unrelenting test. I packed slowly, methodically, listening to the crunch of sand beneath my boots, trying to convince myself that what I had experienced was simply the imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something in Joshua Tree had observed me, measured my resolve, and allowed me to leave only because I had endured without surrender. Every rock, every twisted silhouette of the trees seemed charged with a silent acknowledgement, and I felt simultaneously humbled and violated. There is a rare humility that comes only from confronting a force larger than yourself, and it is not comfortable. It is sharp, pricking at the ego and leaving an imprint of awe and fear intertwined. I decided to hike deeper into the park that morning, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and the stubborn human desire to understand what had nearly unseated me the night before. The desert is deceptive at first light. The shadows of boulders are still long, and the rocks glimmer with a pale gold that makes every crevice appear deeper, every canyon darker. I wandered along trails that were little more than scraped dirt and sand, listening for the faint hum that had followed me, half expecting it to surge again like some living presence. It did not, or at least it did not in any form I could identify. Instead, the silence was absolute, stretching across the landscape with an oppressive intensity that pressed against my chest. I had always appreciated the solitude of these lands, but now I understood the weight of it, the way isolation can sharpen awareness until even the air seems to carry meaning. By noon, I had reached a narrow canyon where sunlight barely touched the ground, the walls of stone rising like ancient fortresses. I decided to rest and drink from my water bottle, and that's when I noticed the small things that had escaped me in the chaos of the night. The scorched earth beneath a cluster of rocks, the faint impressions of animal tracks that did not match any creature I could identify, and the occasional curling of wind that seemed to move against natural logic. My mind, already raw from the night's vigil, began to weave narratives, some reasonable, some impossible. The desert has a way of feeding the imagination while testing the mind's boundaries, and in that moment, I felt the truth of being utterly alone, yet simultaneously observed. Every sound, the scratching of a lizard, the distant call of a hawk, became amplified in meaning, charged with an unspoken significance. It was in that canyon that I realized fear had transformed into vigilance, and vigilance into a peculiar understanding. I could no longer approach the desert with mere confidence or casual curiosity. Every step became a negotiation with the terrain, with the wind, with the hidden forces that the night had hinted at. By mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing where the sun hit unobstructed, and I set down my pack, exhausted but unwilling to rest fully. And then I saw it. Small, almost insignificant, yet it caused a ripple of alarm through my chest. My fire pit from the previous night, the stones rearranged in a subtle, deliberate manner as if someone or something had adjusted them. Nothing else was disturbed. No tracks, no footprints beyond my own. Just the fire pit, the circle of stones, subtly altered, impossibly precise. My rational mind argued against it, insisting on explanations, but my intuition, the one honed through years of wilderness experience, told me otherwise. I was not alone, not in the way I had always understood it. Night fell again faster than I expected, the desert cooling with a sudden harshness. I tried to rebuild the fire, not for warmth but for reassurance, and again the flames resisted. The wind, which had been calm for hours, picked up in irregular gusts, carrying with it the faintest whisper of sound, like the scrape of shoes across stone or the sigh of someone stepping over dry twigs. My heartbeat became a drum in the quiet night, every inhale a negotiation with panic. And then the hum returned, low and insistent, vibrating not just through the ground, but through my bones. I crouched beside the firewood, striking match after match, coaxing, pleading, until a single stubborn flame caught. I felt a temporary triumph, but it was hollow, fragile. I realized then that the desert's challenge was not about fire, not about warmth, not about survival in the traditional sense. It was about presence, humility, the recognition that even the smallest human defiance could provoke forces far beyond comprehension. I spent the night on the edge of consciousness, awake and aware, feeling as if the desert was breathing around me. Every shadow had significance, every shift in the wind a message I could barely interpret. I understood then that fear is not always an external predator. It is internal, manifesting in the spaces where human perception meets the inexplicable. The desert forced me to confront not only what I could see, but what I could not, the invisible threads that tie isolation, nature, and consciousness together into an almost sentient tapestry. And when dawn finally arrived, I emerged from my tent, tired, battered, yet strangely renewed. My eyes were sharper, my senses more attuned, and a subtle reverence had replaced the raw panic of the previous night. I left Joshua Tree that morning carrying more than my backpack. I carried a deepened understanding of the delicate interplay between fear and survival, curiosity and caution, solitude and connection. The desert had shown me a fundamental truth, that every camping trip, every hike into the wilderness is a negotiation with forces both visible and invisible, and that sometimes the most profound lessons are whispered not in safety, but in moments when everything familiar is stripped away. The hum never fully left me. It lingers in memory like a pulse, a reminder that the wilderness remembers those who enter, that it watches, measures, and waits. And as I drove away, the sun rising behind the boulders, I realized that the desert had given me something rarer than peace, a confrontation with the unknown, with fear, with myself, and I emerged not unscathed, but profoundly changed, carrying a story that will never fade, a story that will haunt, illuminate, and inspire anyone who dares to wander where the fire refuses to burn. The canyon walls pressed close around me, their red sandstone faces glowing with the last vestiges of sunset, but the beauty of it all was a fragile illusion. My name is Daniel. I'm 32, and I've been wandering the wilds of the American West since I could walk. I've hiked countless trails, camped under countless skies, yet nothing had prepared me for the eerie, silent watchfulness I felt on that April night in Arches National Park. I arrived in the late afternoon, when the shadows were long and the wind carried a chill that smelled of dust and stone. The locals in Moab had warned me, the desert has a mind of its own. It'll test you. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it watches, and sometimes it follows. I smiled politely, dismissing their words as stories meant for tourists. But now, as the canyon's deep silence pressed against me, I realized how quickly stories could turn into warnings. I had set up camp near a narrow crevice, a natural alcove that promised shelter and solitude. The first hour was uneventful as I gathered firewood and listened to the whisper of the wind across the spires. The world here moves differently, slower, but under a surface of tranquility. There is an undercurrent of something older, something patient. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, that maybe my imagination was stirred by the day's hike through the labyrinthine formations. And yet, as night fell and the last light disappeared behind the rim, I began to hear it. The faintest footfalls on stone that I hadn't climbed, echoing softly in the canyon. I paused, my hands gripping the fire poker, scanning the dark. The sound stopped when I stopped. I moved forward. It moved again. Not a rhythm of wildlife, not the cadence of a falling rock. This was deliberate. The air became heavy with anticipation, a suffocating tension that made my every movement feel amplified. I whispered to myself, trying to rationalize, "It's a deer, a small animal." But the steps continued, light, careful, unnervingly human. My fire, once a comforting glow, now seemed like a beacon to something unseen, something waiting. I crouched lower, listening as the canyon swallowed my heartbeat. The rocks around me held secrets, and I felt as if they were shifting slightly, as though sharing a story that my ears were only beginning to understand. I tried calling out, "Hello?" My voice bounced off the walls, but there was no answer. Only that soft, deliberate echo, following me. Every instinct screamed to run, yet a strange compulsion rooted me to the spot, demanding that I witness, that I understand. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. In that canyon, time seemed to fracture. Shadows grew long and deep, and the temperature dropped sharply. I could hear my own breath, but it was no longer my own. Somewhere above, the cliffs loomed, and from those heights, or perhaps from a different realm altogether, the footsteps traced my movements. I moved cautiously along the narrow trail toward a rock outcropping I had noted earlier, thinking a higher vantage point might reveal the source. My fingers brushed against the rough sandstone, each ridge and groove familiar from daylight, but now strange and threatening. And then, in a split moment that etched itself into memory, I glimpsed a shadow flitting across a distant wall, perfectly timed, perfectly mirrored to my own path. Panic surged, but I forced myself to slow, to breathe, to think. There is a strange clarity that comes in absolute fear, a sharpening of senses that no daylight caution can rival. I reminded myself of everything I knew about survival. Light your fire, make noise, stay visible, and never let the mind succumb to the unknown. I retrieved my flashlight and scanned the canyon floor and cliffs, its beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing. Only rocks, only desert scrub, only the echo of footsteps that no one seemed to be taking. And yet I could feel it, the presence that lingered, patient and unseen. It was no random predator. It was intentional, testing boundaries, measuring my reaction. The desert, I realized, was alive in ways I had never considered. Sleep was impossible, so I stayed awake, eyes darting across shadows, ears straining against silence. The night stretched like a living thing, each moment a brush against my nerves. Every time I thought the steps had vanished, they returned, slower now, almost savoring the tension. I tried recording, tried calling for help, but the canyon swallowed signals, as if it didn't want my presence to reach the outside world. There is a cruelty in being alone in nature, the kind of solitude that feels more like entrapment, a testing ground for the mind. I realized then that fear isn't only in the footsteps behind you, it's in the imagination they ignite, in the what-ifs, in the stories we tell ourselves when logic abandons us. As dawn approached, the canyon walls glowed faintly, painting the shadows in soft amber. I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained, yet the footsteps had stopped. There was a pause in the air, a silence so profound it pressed against my chest. I scanned the horizon, expecting some reveal, some figure silhouetted against the emerging light. Nothing, just the still, serene canyon, betraying no hint of the night's unseen stalker. Relief washed over me, but it was a muted relief, tinged with a deeper understanding. The desert had tested me. had forced me to confront fear in its purest, most intimate form, not through violence, not through threat, but through presence, patience, and uncertainty. I packed my camp slowly, retracing my steps, acutely aware of every echo, every ridge, every crevice. The canyon had taught me something that the locals had hinted at but never fully explained. Nature is not just a backdrop. It is an active participant in our journey, capable of observing, responding, and teaching through fear as much as beauty. As I made my way back to the trailhead, the rising sun illuminating the arches and spires in fiery orange, I understood the lesson in its full weight. Survival is not just a matter of preparation or skill. It is the willingness to face the unknown, to respect the silence, and to acknowledge that sometimes the most haunting presence is not the predator, but the watcher, the one you cannot see, cannot predict, and cannot fully understand. By the time I reached my car, the desert seemed calm, almost inviting again. And yet, the memory of the echoing footsteps lingered, not as a nightmare, but as a permanent imprint, a reminder that the wild has its own consciousness and that our encounters with it shape us in ways we rarely anticipate. Fear, I realized, is not a weakness. It is a teacher, a mirror reflecting the boundaries of our courage, patience, and perception. And in that quiet, in that raw confrontation with the unseen, I discovered a deeper respect for the wilderness, its beauty, its cruelty, and its uncanny ability to make a solitary camper feel both insignificant and profoundly alive. The first time I heard it, the silence was almost unbearable. Not the kind of silence you find in a quiet cabin or beneath the city stars, but the weighty, omnipresent silence of the boundary waters in northern Minnesota. A silence that makes you question whether the forest is simply waiting or watching. My name is Ethan. I'm 29, and I've spent the better part of my adult life chasing the kind of solitude that humbles you, that makes every breath feel like a borrowed gift. June of 2020 found me pushing a canoe through the narrow channels of a river, so still it mirrored the sky with uncanny precision. The kind of reflection that seems like it belongs to another world, another dimension where the rules of reality are softer, bendable, and slightly askew. I had been camping in these waters before, guided by locals who spoke in reverent tones about the spirits of the lakes and the whispers that moved with the wind. But nothing could have prepared me for the kind of movement that wasn't movement at all, the subtle dissonance that sets your nerves alight without giving you a single clue to its source. I had set out that morning with two old friends, both as hungry for isolation as I was, our packs heavy with tents, supplies, and the quiet arrogance of people who believe nature bends to their will. The river was deceptively calm, the sun pooling in the shallows, highlighting the shallow beds of pebbles like the bottom of a glass. We paddled in rhythm, the canoe slicing through water that made no sound except the occasional slap of a paddle, until the forest walls on either side grew closer, more suffocating. That's when I noticed it first. The water ahead didn't ripple the way it should when the wind stirred, and yet, faintly, almost imperceptibly, there was motion. Something skimming beneath the surface, just enough to unsettle the reflection, just enough to make me pause mid-stroke and glance at my friends, hoping they had noticed too. They hadn't, but I did. It was at the first river bend that the sensation escalated from unease to a quiet, gnawing fear. I could feel the air change, thickening as though the space around us had developed a heartbeat independent of our own. Shadows clung to the trees in impossible ways, stretching and recoiling as if the light itself was afraid to stay. And then, movement. A dark, fluid shape just beneath the water, shifting with deliberate intent, moving parallel to us but never fully revealing itself. I froze. My friends laughed nervously, thinking I'd seen a beaver or the exaggerated wake of a fish, but I knew it was different. There was a rhythm to it, a pulse that did not belong to any animal I had ever encountered. Something alive, intelligent, and patient. something that had been here long before our arrival and would remain long after we were gone. We reached the campsite at the edge of a narrow island by noon. The trees leaned inward protectively, and the river narrowed to a whisper around its curves. As we set up tents and unpacked supplies, I could not shake the feeling of being observed. Every crack of a branch, every ripple across the water felt like a signal. I tried to dismiss it as imagination, the residual tension of too many nights spent alone in the wilderness, but the evidence was subtle and accumulating. Canoe tracks we had left behind earlier were disturbed. A pattern of small stones along the bank had shifted, as if someone or something had rearranged them while we were distracted. That night, sitting by the fire as the sun bled into the water, I noticed ripples again, concentric and perfect, radiating from the far shore toward our camp, though the water was otherwise glassy. No wind, no rain, nothing to cause the movement. Just a steady, slow, almost purposeful undulation, as if the river itself were alive and breathing. Sleep that night was fractured. Every shadow in the tent seemed to stretch toward me. Every whisper of the wind like a voice trying to form words I could not understand. I lay awake, counting breaths, listening for footsteps that might exist only in my mind. And then, around 3 a.m, I heard the first sound that confirmed what I had feared, something sliding along the edge of the river, a soft but deliberate sound of contact, the scrape of a body against stone and mud, following the contours of the shoreline. I held my breath. My friends were sleeping, oblivious. The fire had died to embers, leaving the woods in an inky darkness where the trees merged into the night itself. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before, and I realized with a cold clarity that whatever it was aware of me. It was watching, timing its movements, letting me know that I was not alone. Morning brought a false sense of security. The sun rose, the birds returned, and the water looked innocent once more, yet nothing had changed. My mind was alert, hyper-aware of every sound, every subtle shift in the wind or water. We decided to paddle upriver, seeking a trail that led to another lake, hoping to put distance between ourselves and whatever haunted the island. The river narrowed further, the trees pressing closer, forming a tunnel of green that limited vision to a few feet ahead. And then it happened again. Something in the water, just beneath the surface, moving in tandem with us, but always slightly to the side, always staying just out of reach. My hands gripped the paddle tighter, knuckles white, heart hammering against my chest in a rhythm that matched the unseen pulse beneath the water. Hours passed like this, each bend in the river revealing no answers, only more questions. We passed a small inlet where the water shimmered with an unnatural clarity, revealing shapes that seemed wrong, elongated, distorted, moving in ways that defied the current. I tried to rationalize, to convince myself that it was debris, logs, or fish. But rationality fled when I heard the splash behind us, closer than any fish could make, followed by a sound of heavy breathing, deep and wet, echoing across the river. My friends looked at me, eyes wide, sensing the change in my demeanor, but they could not hear it, could not feel the way the air thickened with a presence we could not see. By evening, we found a second campsite, this one less isolated, a small clearing with more sunlight filtering through the branches. Still, the river carried its secret. That night, I kept watch while the others slept, crouched by the water's edge, senses straining. Shadows moved differently, not cast by the moon or firelight, but by something else. The water pulsed with silent waves that refused to break, forming shapes that seemed almost human. And in those shapes, I saw intention, awareness, a quiet, patient hunger that the wilderness could harbor without laws or conscience. I realized that our presence here was an intrusion, a temporary trespass in a place that had its own guardians, its own rules. And the river, silent as it was neither forgiving nor cruel. It was simply watching, learning, waiting. By the third day, the tension had grown unbearable. My friends began to notice changes too. The shifting stones, the ripples in the water, fleeting shadows on the banks that disappeared when we turned to look. Panic simmered beneath the surface of our camaraderie. We debated leaving, but the route out was complex, requiring portages and a long journey against a current we could barely read. Yet we moved, cautiously, avoiding bends where the water's surface betrayed the hidden pulse beneath. The final confrontation came when we reached a wide stretch of river, the canoe gliding over glassy water. A shape rose from the depths, impossible to identify, massive yet fluid, a silhouette that seemed both ancient and elemental. It lingered watching and then vanished with a single ripple, leaving us shaken and silent. I realized in that moment that what we experienced was not malevolent in a human sense. It was otherworldly, a reminder of the untamed, unknowable wilderness we had entered. We left the boundary waters that day with more than just memories. We carried with us an understanding that fear in the wild is not always born of threat, but of respect, of recognition that life exists beyond our comprehension, and that some rivers, some forests will always hold secrets we are never meant to disturb. The pulse beneath the water, the silent observer, had taught us a lesson in humility, a truth that will follow me every time I hear a river in the deep woods, that solitude is never empty, that silence is never innocent, and that the forest remembers every footstep, every intruder, and every story it witnesses. The first thing I remember is the silence, not the peaceful silence of untouched woods or the quiet lull of nature breathing around you, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that pressed against the edges of my senses, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. My name is Carter, I'm 34, and for most of my life, I've chased the hidden corners of the Appalachian woods, the forgotten trails, the places where the wind whispers secrets to those who listen closely. But nothing I'd encountered before prepared me for what I faced in Everglades National Park that February of 2023. I'd chosen a remote site near Mahogany Hammock, far from the designated camping areas, where the waterlogged earth held the smell of decay and something older, something unspoken, lingered in the humid air. I set up my tent as the sun sank behind the gnarled cypress trees, their roots like twisted fingers clutching at the dark waters. The mosquitoes were relentless, buzzing like miniature drones in my ears, and the humidity weighed down every breath. By the time I had a small fire going, the sky had drained of color, leaving only the gray smear of night creeping over the marshes. It was then that I first noticed the subtle signs that something or someone was moving nearby. At first, it was just a rustle in the tall sawgrass, so faint I questioned my own hearing. But then came the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot, deliberate and slow, moving in a pattern that suggested intelligence rather than the random wanderings of wildlife. I froze, heart hammering against my chest. Most people in my line of camping would have laughed it off, called it a deer or an alligator moving through shallow water. But I've learned over years of solitary treks that the woods speak their own truths, and every instinct screamed that I was being watched. I whispered a quiet prayer, telling myself to stay calm, to breathe, yet my hands shook as I checked my flashlight and my small pocket knife. That night, sleep came in fragments, each time broken by subtle disturbances outside my tent. The soft brush of something across the nylon fabric, the distant echo of a low thump on the ground, then silence, as if whatever had approached was just testing my presence. Morning brought no relief. My gear was in disarray, tent stakes partially uprooted, and the familiar order I had meticulously arranged the night before seemed almost violated by some unseen hand. Nothing was stolen, nothing overtly damaged, but the message was clear. Someone or something had been here. As I ventured into the swamp to check the surrounding area, the footprints in the soft mud caught my attention. They were human-like, though oddly distorted, elongated as if the owner moved with a peculiar gait. The waterlogged earth held the evidence for only a moment before it began to erase itself, but the memory of their shape lingered. I realized then that this was no random camper, no casual wanderer. This was a presence that was familiar with these woods, familiar with me. The rest of the day unfolded with an almost cinematic tension. Every trip to the water for refills, every return to my tent, I felt it. The shadow lingering behind cypress knees, the subtle reflection of movement just at the edge of my vision. I spoke aloud to myself, a kind of verbal reassurance, as if voicing my presence would prevent me from being erased entirely. As night fell again, I built my fire higher than usual, the flames dancing wildly against the mist that rose from the swamp. And then it happened, a sudden, sharp tearing noise from the back of my tent. My stomach dropped. Slowly, deliberately, I unzipped the flap, expecting to confront some wild animal, some raccoon or stray boar. But there was nothing. No shape, no form, only the displaced tent fabric, wrinkled as though it had been pressed by hands that belonged to no living thing. I stayed awake the entire night, torchlight slicing through the darkness, listening to the swamp breathe, waiting for the inevitable. By the faint gray of dawn, my exhaustion was total, but the terror was not diminished. That morning, I explored further, following a winding path through thick vegetation, coming upon remnants of small fires and trampled plants that could not have been left by me alone. The sense of intrusion was complete. Each step I took was measured, cautious, aware that the woods had shifted somehow in my presence. And yet, in the midst of fear, a strange clarity came over me, a recognition that the wilderness, in its raw, untamed form, is not just a backdrop for human adventure. It is a living entity, aware, patient, and often judgmental. By the second night, I had resolved to face the phantom directly. I set up cameras and tripwires, marking every approach to my tent with careful precision. The air was thick with humidity, each breath sticky in my lungs, and the forest seemed to close in, anticipating my vigil. At midnight, I heard the noise again. The deliberate, cautious rustling, the soft press of unseen feet on the mossy ground. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, following the shape of the movement, and for a brief instant caught the outline of a figure crouching near the edge of the marsh. It was humanoid, cloaked in shadow, features indistinct yet terrifyingly human. And then, like a wisp of smoke, it vanished into the night, leaving nothing but the echo of fear and the cold realization that my solitude had been a mere illusion. Over the next few days, I adapted, learning to move silently, to anticipate the disturbances, to exist in a state of heightened awareness. The presence never attacked, never revealed intent beyond watching. And in that careful observation, I found a strange, unspoken lesson. Fear is not only survival, it is also understanding. The woods are not hostile, they are impartial. They do not punish the careless. They merely reveal the consequences of your choices, the vulnerabilities you refuse to acknowledge. I left that site in February with a profound respect, a quiet awe, and the persistent awareness that the Everglades had allowed me to glimpse a dimension of life where boundaries between the human and the unknown are fluid, where every tent stake hammered into the earth becomes a claim, a promise, a statement that you exist and are seen. Even now, months later, the memory clings to me, not as a story to frighten friends around a campfire, but as a lesson in vigilance, humility, and the fragile courage required to step into the unknown. Each creak of a branch in the Appalachian forests, each glint of movement in the corner of my eye recalls that February night, the night when I realized that being alone in the wild is a privilege, but one that demands respect, attention, and the willingness to face fear unflinchingly. The phantom camper, whatever it was, taught me that survival is not merely about strength or skill. It is about presence, awareness, and the willingness to see the unseen, to endure the unease, and to carry forward with an understanding that the woods do not conform to human expectations, but instead, humans must learn to walk in the rhythm of the wild, quietly, carefully, and with open eyes. The night fell with a suddenness that seemed almost deliberate, as if the mountains themselves had drawn a curtain across the sky, swallowing the last traces of light and leaving the world in a silence that was heavier than any sound. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 32, and I had spent the last decade chasing the wilderness, learning its moods and believing I understood the rhythm of the forest. But that night in Rocky Mountain National Park, a place I thought I knew like the lines on my palms, taught me a lesson that no map, no guidebook, and no previous camping trip could have prepared me for. I arrived at the trailhead just as the sun was bleeding its last orange into the horizon, the mountains casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into forever. I had come alone, a conscious choice, craving the solitude that only a late autumn forest could provide. The air was crisp, the smell of pine sharp and sweet, but beneath it, I sensed a weight, subtle, pressing, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The locals I'd met days earlier in Estes Park had warned me about the high-altitude nights, the sudden drops in temperatures, and, though they couched it in humor, about strange noises that wandered the trails when the wind refused to blow. I had laughed then. I was an experienced camper. I was prepared. By the time I found a small clearing near Glacier Creek to set up my tent, the sun had vanished completely, leaving only the deep violet of twilight, fading quickly into black. I worked quickly, aware of the chill creeping through my jacket and down my spine, and as I pitched my tent, I noticed the forest had gone unnaturally still. No rustling of leaves, no distant calls of birds returning to roost, nothing but the muted crackle of my small campfire and the occasional distant gurgle of the creek. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the season, to the windless night, and soon I was sitting by the fire, sipping hot coffee from my thermos, feeling the calm that comes when you're wrapped in the solitude of the wild. Then it began. A sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. Low, long, drawn out, a howl, but not carried on the wind, not echoing through the valleys as a wolf's cry might. It came from somewhere deep in the darkness, close enough that I could feel its vibration in my chest, but distant enough that I could not see its source. I froze, my instincts screaming to bolt, to run back down the trail to civilization. Yet some part of me, the part that had wandered these woods countless times, whispered that running would be worse. So I stayed, straining to catch any hint of movement, any shadow that might betray what made that sound. Hours passed, though I swear it was only minutes before the howling returned, again and again, closer this time, circling my campsite as though testing the edges of my presence. I called out once, my voice sounding small, almost foolish against the void, but there was no reply. Only the echo of my own words bouncing back at me, twisted, unfamiliar. The fire flickered as if it sensed the intrusion, and I realized then that fear is not just a physical sensation. It is a forest that grows inside your mind, roots creeping into your thoughts, threading through every memory of safety you thought you owned. I had prepared for cold, for bears, for injury, for storms, but not for this. Consciousness of being watched, hunted, and alone. I remember clutching my flashlight, waving it across the tree line, the beam catching nothing but trees, shadows, and the subtle sway of branches. Yet the sound continued, a deliberate, intelligent presence. I told myself it was a coyote, perhaps a lone wolf, a predator of the high Rockies. Logic tried to keep me anchored. But logic is fragile when the night presses in, when your own heartbeat becomes the loudest sound, and when the forest seems to lean closer with every passing second. I felt small, a human anomaly in a world that was old beyond comprehension, and that realization was more terrifying than any creature I might imagine. Then I saw movement, subtle at first, a dark silhouette flitting between the trees, impossible to discern, yet undeniably there. My rational mind raced, naming every animal in the Rockies, trying to convince me I was safe, that fear was just fear. But the silhouette moved in ways no animal should, deliberate and cautious, and every time I shifted my flashlight, it vanished, only to reappear moments later, closer, watching, waiting. And the howling, never ending, a chorus of one voice, yet somehow more than human, filled the night, a sound that carried intent, a message I could not decipher but felt deeply in my bones. I sat frozen, torn between the urge to run and the necessity of staying put. I had read stories of hikers who fled into the dark, never to be found, and stories of those who stayed, confronted the unknown, and survived with more than just their lives intact. They survived with a story to tell. So I stayed. I whispered my own presence aloud, my voice trembling, hoping that acknowledgement might placate whatever watched me. The forest held its breath, and the howl shifted, a low rumble, almost contemplative, as if measuring me, deciding if I belonged or if I was to be forgotten. Hours bled into each other. I tried to eat, tried to drink, but the fire, the only tether to warmth and reality, flickered too quickly, threatened to die with every gust of breathless air that was somehow moving in the stillness. I heard footsteps, subtle, deliberate, circling my tent. Each time I raised my flashlight, nothing. Yet, each time, the sense of being encircled tightened, a noose of sensation that told me I was not alone in a forest that should have been silent. My mind wandered to the locals, the stories they told with half smiles, warnings I had ignored. I understood now, this was not a prank of imagination nor a simple animal's lament. This was something older, a night that had its own rules, and I was intruding. At one point, I convinced myself that dawn would come, that morning would save me from the long, impossible night. But the stars offered no comfort. They were cold, distant, indifferent to my human fear. The howling never ceased, only shifted in rhythm and intensity, mocking, testing, echoing the panic that had taken root in me. I thought of my life, of the fragile bubble of security I carried in the city, of friends and family, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of isolation. Nature had always been a teacher, a sanctuary, and a challenge. But that night, it was a judge, and I was on trial. Eventually, the sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun. A silence followed, not the absence of noise, but the presence of waiting, heavy and aware. I did not move for what felt like hours, afraid to break the spell, afraid that any breath, any shift, any noise would bring it back. When I finally dared to step outside the tent, the world had changed. The trees were the same, the creek still gurgled, yet the air carried a memory of presence, something beyond comprehension, something I had survived by sheer persistence and perhaps a measure of respect. I packed quickly, leaving no trace, walking down the trail as the first light of dawn tinged the horizon, pale and tentative, like a whisper of forgiveness from the mountains themselves. I returned to Estes Park shaken, not by injury or weather, but by the knowledge that the wilderness is alive in ways we cannot predict, and that fear is not just instinct, but understanding. I tell this story now not to frighten, but to illuminate. The deep woods hold lessons beyond survival, truths that scrape against your sense of control and invite you into humility. The howl without wind remains etched in my memory, a reminder that the wild is older, wiser, and far stranger than our human minds can fully grasp. That night, I learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of facing the incomprehensible with awareness, reverence, and a sliver of faith that one can emerge intact. The branches scratched the roof like skeletal fingers, whispering threats I couldn't see but could feel deep in my chest. I hadn't realized how quiet the forest could become until that night, until the world seemed to compress itself around the small clearing where I had pitched my tent. My name is Marcus. I'm 32, and I've spent most of my adult life chasing solitude in the deep woods of the Appalachian and Adirondack ranges. I've hiked through fog so thick it swallowed the sun. I've camped near rivers that roared like wild beasts. And yet, nothing had prepared me for the terror of being trapped in a place that should have been sanctuary. Adirondack Park, New York, July 2018. The summer air was sticky, humming with cicadas, and the kind of heavy stillness that makes you question whether you are alone or simply forgotten. I had driven up from Albany with two close friends, people I trusted with my life, though on that night, trust would prove a fragile thing. We had been chasing a trail that locals swore was cursed, or at least dangerous in ways that didn't appear on maps or in trail guides. It was the lesser-known path near the west branch of the Sacandaga River, the kind of forest where moss grows thick and trails disappear overnight after a storm. The day had been long, our packs heavy with food and equipment, and our conversations had turned from laughter to silence as shadows lengthened and the sun dipped below the horizon. There was something about the way the trees leaned, the way the wind carried voices that weren't there, that made my stomach tighten as we approached a small clearing that seemed perfect for our camp. We set up our tents quickly, aware that darkness falls fast in these mountains. The canopy above was dense, a lattice of branches that let only fragmented light through, turning everything into jagged silhouettes. Dinner was a quiet affair. The usual chatter of a camping trip was absent, replaced by the sound of insects and the low, eerie rustle of leaves. That was when I first noticed the scratching. At first, I blamed it on the wind, or perhaps a raccoon, though I knew raccoons didn't climb like that. It started soft, like fingernails on old wood, and then it intensified, more deliberate, more human. My friends laughed nervously, calling it forest ghosts, but the sound didn't move, didn't wander. It circled, hovered above the tent like a warning. As night deepened, the wind died, and the forest's whispers grew louder. We attempted to shake off the unease, lighting a fire, roasting marshmallows, talking about mundane things like anything to anchor ourselves to reality. But the branches wouldn't stop. They tapped, scraped, and sometimes pounded against the tent as though testing our resolve. I remember gripping my flashlight, swinging it toward the trees, and catching only brief glimpses of movement, a shadow vanishing just beyond the firelight, a glint of something watching. My pulse raced, my breath came in short bursts, and yet I couldn't bring myself to leave the tent. Part of me wanted to run blindly into the dark, but instinct told me that the forest itself would swallow me before I could escape. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became irrelevant. Then came the voices, whispered at first, faint, just on the edge of hearing, like someone speaking from behind the trees. Help, help us. Or maybe, leave now. It's hard to remember exactly what was said because the mind starts to fracture when confronted with the inexplicable. My friends were tense, silent, staring at the trees as if willing them to explain themselves. I tried reasoning with myself. It was an echo, a trick of the wind through the branches, maybe a far-off camper playing pranks, but the sound was too precise, too intentional. It was around us, under us, and inside us. I realized we were no longer visitors, we were intruders. By the time I peeked outside the tent, the moon had risen high enough to illuminate the clearing, yet the light was deceptive. The forest around us seemed larger, stretching impossibly into shadow as if it had grown overnight. The branches weren't just scratching the roof anymore. They were reaching toward us, scratching the fire, bending toward our small circle of warmth. A shape moved in the trees, tall, thin, impossibly still, watching, waiting. I froze, heart hammering, and that's when the smell hit me. Damp earth mixed with something coppery, metallic, like blood or rust. My stomach churned, my mind screamed, and my friends whispered that we should leave. But our gear was scattered, our path unclear, and the forest had become a labyrinth with no exit. We debated, should we stay put, wait for daylight, or risk moving in the dark? My instincts screamed to flee, but every time I tried to step out, the branches lashed at my legs, snagging my clothes, scratching my skin. It wasn't just nature. It was something alive, sentient. Panic rose, but I fought it down. I remembered the stories the locals told, of hikers who vanished, of campers who returned changed, hollow-eyed, speaking in whispers. I didn't want to be another cautionary tale. So we sat, pressed together in the tent, listening, counting our breaths, watching shadows stretch and twist around the firelight. Somewhere in the night, I realized the forest was teaching us patience. It wasn't about running, it wasn't about screaming, it was about understanding the subtle cues, A certain pattern to the scratching, a rhythm to the whispers. I began marking the scratches on the tent with my flashlight, trying to decipher intent, trying to communicate back in small, deliberate gestures. Oddly, the scratching slowed, then stopped. The whispers faded to nothing. By dawn, the forest had shifted again. Trees were no longer leaning, shadows retreated, and the air was calm, almost serene. It was as though we had passed some unspoken test, though the terror of the night remained etched in our minds. By the time we packed up, the forest had returned to the ordinary quiet of morning. Birds chirped, dew glistened on leaves, and yet we moved with a new awareness, every step cautious, every sound noted. I realized that fear in the forest isn't always about monsters or creatures. It's about humility, about recognizing that you are a guest in a world that doesn't bend to your expectations. The scratching branches had shown us the fragility of human confidence, the way the forest observes and responds, and the thin line between curiosity and survival. Even now, years later, I remember the sound of those branches, the way they scraped, almost rhythmically, almost communicatively. I remember the suffocating fear of being trapped and the clarity that came from listening rather than acting, watching rather than fleeing. The Adirondacks had left a mark on me, a reminder that adventure carries risk, that the woods hold secrets not meant to be unraveled too quickly, and that the line between reality and something older, something aware, is thinner than we imagine. And every time I camp in those mountains, every time I hear a scratch against my tent or a whisper in the wind, I remember that night, that lesson, and I am both humbled and haunted. I had always believed the woods held stories you couldn't imagine. Whispers in the wind, shadows that lingered too long, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone you knew. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 29 at the time, and the deep stretches of Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Ohio had become my refuge, my escape from the hum of the city, from the constant ache of deadlines and obligations. I had wandered these trails countless times, alone, under the hush of early morning fog or the heavy weight of an October dusk. But nothing in those routine hikes had prepared me for the disappearance I would witness, something that would etch itself into the marrow of my bones and change the way I trusted the forest forever. It was late October, and the leaves had begun their violent transformation, reds and golds swirling in gusts of wind that carried the scent of decay. The park was sparsely populated. Most casual hikers had retreated to the safety of the visitor center or the warmth of their homes. I had decided to camp along a lesser-known trail near the Brandywine Falls, where the roar of the water masked the subtle whispers of the forest. I wasn't alone entirely. 2 friends had joined me, cautious but eager to embrace the thrill of a deep woods adventure. Among them was Mark, a hiker I had known since college, who carried his camera everywhere and documented life as if the world might vanish tomorrow. The first night was unremarkable in its beauty. We set our small camp beneath towering oaks, their skeletal limbs swaying, casting spindly shadows across the tent. As night descended, the forest seemed to exhale, a low, almost human sound that rippled through the branches. It was Mark who first noticed the odd footprints circling the camp. Not ours, not any animal we recognized. I remember the way his voice caught when he whispered the observation, the way our shared gaze flicked between the darkness and each other, weighing disbelief against fear. There was a tension then, quiet but insistent, that something was off, something pressing against the edges of our world that we couldn't see. We tried to dismiss it the way humans do with rational explanations, perhaps a raccoon, perhaps a wandering dog. Sleep came reluctantly, broken by dreams that weren't mine, visions of shadows moving against the grain of the moonlight, of unseen eyes tracing my every breath. When morning arrived, the forest looked innocent, deceptive in its calm. Yet the sense of being watched lingered, and the footprints hadn't vanished. They were faint now, but still there, circling the place where our tents had been pitched. Mark, compelled by some mix of fear and obsession, decided he would follow them, just for a little while, to see where they led. I protested, a tightening in my chest I didn't fully understand, but he laughed off my concern, and with the bravado of youth, he disappeared into the undergrowth, the crunch of leaves swallowing his steps. Hours passed. The forest shifted, shadows lengthening unnaturally as the sun struggled to pierce the thick canopy. I called for him at first with mild irritation, then with growing anxiety, then with the raw edge of panic. My voice seemed to vanish into the mist, returning only as a hollow echo. And then I noticed something I should never have missed. The trail, the tiny signs of his presence. Broken twigs, a backpack strap snagged on a thorn bush, stopped abruptly. No footprints, no indication of direction. It was as though the forest had simply swallowed him whole. My friends and I scoured the surrounding trails, our shouts cutting through the thinning daylight, but each step deeper only amplified the feeling that we were being observed, that the forest itself was breathing around us, waiting. As night fell again, the horror settled like frost. There was no sign of Mark, and the sense of being alone was terrifyingly absolute. We returned to the camp, hoping to find some clue, some trace, but it was as though he had never been there. And then we heard it, the faintest sound of movement, but not in the way of a human footfall. It was intermittent, circling the periphery of the campsite, moving in ways that no animal should move, impossible in its timing and rhythm. My rational mind faltered. I had read about the legends the locals whispered in hushed tones, vanishing hikers, shadows that lured people off trails, old spirits that claimed those who wandered too far, but I had never believed. That night, belief arrived with ice in my veins. We stayed awake in the dark, listening to the forest's relentless murmurs. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch made our hearts jump. Fear transformed into obsession. The drive to find Mark overrode reason. I remember crawling through underbrush, calling his name until my throat was raw, until my voice was swallowed by the night, until despair began to fracture the edges of my mind. And then at the base of a steep ravine near the falls, I saw it. The glint of his camera lens, abandoned, lying on the forest floor. The strap was twisted around a small, gnarled tree, and the photos inside revealed what we couldn't see with our eyes. The forest from angles impossible for a human to take. Strange distortions, shadows that moved against the logic of light, a presence just beyond recognition. That night, we camped with torches burning low, the wind shrieking through the canopy as if mocking our helplessness. The absence of Mark was no longer just absence. It was a presence in itself, a hole in reality that demanded acknowledgement. When morning arrived, we found signs that defied explanation. Footprints that started normally but dissolved mid-stride. Patches of ground where the soil seemed churned as if someone, or something, had been trying to drag itself upright. We documented everything, trembling, whispering theories we did not believe, theories that seemed inadequate in the face of what had occurred. By then, it was clear that this was no ordinary disappearance. The forest had claimed him, and every shadow, every rustle, reminded us that we were not entirely safe, that the rules of human perception did not fully apply here. As we finally emerged from the park, carrying what little evidence we could, I felt an unease that clung to my skin like a second layer. Weeks later, authorities confirmed that Mark was still missing, though search teams had scoured the area repeatedly. It became a local legend, whispered warnings for hikers. Stay on the trail, keep your friends close, the forest watches. And though rationally I understood the danger, I could not shake the emotional scar. Every time I return to Cuyahoga Valley, I feel the weight of that October night, the sensation of being observed, of shadows that linger just beyond the edge of vision. I learned, painfully, that fear in the woods is not always loud. Sometimes it is subtle, creeping into your mind, altering your perception, leaving questions with no answers and truths you are too frightened to acknowledge. The forest teaches lessons in silence and absence, in the spaces between known paths. I carry that night with me, not as a memory to recount lightly, but as a caution, as a guide for anyone who dares to wander where the trees grow thick and the wind whispers too sharply. There is a profound humility in walking where the earth remembers those who vanished, in understanding that fear is not an enemy, but a messenger. In the haunting of Cuyahoga Valley and the disappearance that defied reason, I discovered that true courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to walk forward, to listen, to feel every shadow, and still honor the call of the wild. I've always believed that the woods have a memory, a way of holding on to the footsteps of those who pass through them, and of whispering their presence back when least expected. My name is Daniel, I'm 34, and in May of 2021, I found myself on the rim of Crater Lake National Park in Oregon, chasing solitude and a reprieve from the relentless city hum. I was with two old friends, fellow campers who shared my appetite for the quiet, for the taste of damp pine in the morning, for the way the wind threads through the pines and leaves the world feeling suspended between breaths. We came seeking the beauty, but we discovered the gaze of something far older, far colder than any human mind can comfortably hold. The first night was deceptively serene. The lake lay still, a mirror broken only by the occasional ripple of a wind-drifting leaf. Our tents were pitched on a ridge that overlooked the water, and we cooked a simple meal over a small fire, the smell of smoked fish and burning woodling with the crisp mountain air. Laughter flowed easily at first. We traded old stories, the kind that feel hollow in hindsight but anchor us to the people we are. Around midnight, the laughter faded into the dark. That's when I first noticed it. A movement, subtle, along the far tree line, just beyond the reach of our firelight. At first I thought it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the motion was too deliberate, too measured. My heart stuttered in that quiet in the way it does when instinct overrides thought. By the second night, the sensation had grown into something we couldn't ignore. Footsteps, or maybe not footsteps, but the sound of something pacing through the undergrowth, drifted toward our campsite, always just at the edge of hearing. My friends tried to laugh it off. "It's the wind," they said, though their voices carried a tension I hadn't heard before. I kept watch through the thin mesh of my tent, scanning the shadows for anything that might explain the noise. And then I saw them, eyes glowing faintly, reflecting the silver light of the moon. They didn't blink, didn't move like any animal I've ever seen. They just watched, unblinking, patient, waiting. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to stay calm, to remember the logical explanations, an owl, maybe, or a wandering camper. But the primal part of me froze, rooted to the spot, because nothing in my life had ever felt like being watched by a presence that understood you in ways no human could. The days blurred into an uneasy rhythm. We would hike during daylight, telling ourselves that visibility would protect us. We explored the jagged trails that circled the rim, the waters of the lake below a surreal molten blue. But even in the bright, clean air, I felt it. The gaze returning ill forms, a snapped branch on an empty trail, a shadow slipping behind a rock where it had no business being. Once, while I took a photograph of the lake, I swore I caught a glimpse of a figure standing on the far shore, watching us. When I blinked, it was gone. The rational mind fights, insists on explanations, but fear is a patient teacher. It teaches in moments between blinks, in the silence between steps, in the space where logic cannot reach. One evening, we decided to push further into the less traveled northern trail, hoping distance from the main campground would grant us peace. The forest closed around us like a cathedral, tall pines casting long, oppressive shadows. The mist began to gather, curling around tree trunks, softening the world until shapes wavered, became unreal. That's when it happened, the first real encounter. I felt breath on my neck, a cold whisper that could have been the wind, but it wasn't. My friend Alex swore he saw the eyes again, not two, but dozens, peering from the mist, circling us. Panic rippled, quiet and sharp, a tightening of the chest. We ran, though we didn't know exactly where, the mist thick as wool around us, swallowing the trail, twisting the trees into grotesque parodies of familiar forms. And behind us, always, came the sound of something moving with a purpose, keeping pace with our terror. By the third night, the terror had become intimate. In the safe light of the fire, we tried to laugh, to regain control, but the laughter felt hollow. The mist rolled down the ridges, and with it came the sense that the forest itself was breathing. Each rustle of leaves sounded like footfalls, each snap of a twig a warning. Sleep was shallow, fractured by half-dreams of eyes watching from the dark, of hands brushing the tents when no one was there. One of my friends woke screaming, claiming he felt a hand on his shoulder, warm and insistent. I wanted to tell him it was the mind playing tricks, that the forest exaggerates fear into hallucinations, but I had felt it too, the undeniable pressure of observation, the invisible weight pressing against your sanity. We decided to leave before dawn. Packing silently, our movements mechanical, we felt the forest's eyes follow us to the last moment. Just as we reached the trailhead, I turned back once more, and in that fleeting moment, I saw a figure standing among the trees, utterly still, watching us leave. Its shape was human enough to be recognized, but wrong in ways that the mind cannot comfortably catalog. No one spoke as we drove away, the engines growl loud against the quiet of the mountains. Only when the road curved out of view did we finally exhale, the tension uncoiling like a spring released too late. Even now, months later, I carry that night with me. There are nights when I hear a rustle outside my window and my chest tightens, when the memory of those eyes in the mist presses against me, reminding me that some places are not meant for understanding, only for reverence. Camping teaches you humility, yes, but it also teaches you vigilance, the necessity of paying attention to the world as it truly is, not as you wish it to be. There are stories the forest keeps to itself, lessons wrapped in fear, and you survive only by listening, by moving with care, by acknowledging that the world is not entirely yours to command. I learned painfully that night that the wilderness has its own consciousness, that fear is not an enemy but a guide, and that to venture into the deep woods is to step into a dialogue you may not understand until you are very, very close to its edge. The mist over Crater Lake was not simply fog, it was a veil between the known and the unknowable, and behind it were eyes that measured us, judged us, and perhaps decided we were not worth their intervention, at least not yet. Each sound, each shadow, each cold brush of wind became a teacher in patience, observation, and respect. I left with a new awareness. The woods remember, the woods watch, and when you are alone enough, they may let you see the truth behind the trees.